Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 37 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I have attorney and firearms instructor Mike Ooley back in the studio for Monday Gun Day to discuss how to handle the 911 call after self-defense. Welcome to the show again, Mike.
Hey, good morning. Glad to be here.
Good morning. So, a lot of times people think about and give a lot of thought to the critical incident itself, that act of self-defense and how they would handle that, and they train for it and they think about it ahead of time. But what a lot of times people overlook is how to handle the aftermath of that self-defense encounter. And we're going to get into that a little bit today with the 911 call and how to handle that 911 call, or even whether or not you should make the 911 call. So, Mike, as we teach this actually in a 5-hour class about the legal aspects of the lawful use of force and self-defense and just carrying a firearm. But this is a component of that class, and we often, we do always actually cover this topic. So I guess to start out, with respect to the 911 call, it's a topic, like I said, that people often overlook, but it's a very important topic to think about ahead of time, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. You know, a lot of time, once again, a few weeks ago, we talked about Colonel Cooper's combat triad. The marksmanship's the most, or strike that, the mindset's the most important with marksmanship and gun handling being components of that combat triad. And a lot of people focus just on the gun handling and the marksmanship. But with respect to a self-defense incident, or a critical incident, as we call it sometimes, we need to think about the aftermath. After we hopefully have survived a fight, if we have to do it, of course, we always want to avoid that if possible. But after the fight, we need to know what we're doing to survive the legal aftermath of that fight. And one of the things we do is one of the things we talk about is interaction with officials or police officers. And we even break that down further, usually in the 911 call is the first phase. Although you're not technically talking to a police officer generally in that context, you're talking to a government official of some sort. And then the second phase we talk about is how to respond to the initial arriving officers to the scene. Those will usually be police officers. Usually, one would expect in a marked police car, uniforms, badges, your typical patrol officer. And then the third area of interaction that we talk about in this class is usually interaction with what will typically be detectives or more senior police officers who, after the scene is secured and those sorts of things, they try to get down into the intricacies of what happened. Today, though, once you mentioned our class, it's 5.5 hours long generally, sometimes longer. We're going to constrain our discussion today of thoughts and what you may want to do or may want to think about with respect to the 911 call that you're going to have to make. And I talked about the three interactions with the different types of police officers, officials. We're not talking about today that interaction with the arriving police officers or the detectives later on. And there's a big debate there about, amongst attorneys about whether you ever say anything to the police officers or not. Just absolutely one school of thought is you absolutely remain silent. You never say a thing. That is held by the vast majority of criminal defense attorneys. That opinion is anyway. But there is this other school of thought that says, well, maybe you ought to say a little, particularly if you're an innocent guy or gal. And if you're disciplined enough and trained enough to do it, there probably ought to be some things that you ought to say just to bolster the result that should come from this self-defense encounter, and that is that you're not going to be charged. But once again, that's a topic for another day. We're going to constrain ourselves to just talking about the 911 call. And you're going to call. The reason I raised this debate about whether you say nothing at all or a little bit, the 911 call is something. You're going to say something. You're going to call 911. I don't think there's anybody that's not going to tell you to call 911. Any attorney.
And that's assuming that a firearm is involved, right?
Yes.
In some form or fashion. We'll get into that a little bit.
Yeah, and what we're going to tell you is you're going to need to call 911 anytime there's what we call a DGU, or a defensive gun use, and that may mean the firearm is discharged or not. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. But you want to call 911, absolutely. I think this kind of goes without saying, but there's some reasons to do that. If you don't call 911, somebody else is likely to call 911. The bad guys know the system. They may call 911 and fabricate a story. So we want to make sure that the facts do come out, and we start this process in a way where the truth is espoused first. The 911 call also it identifies victims and the perpetrators, the good guys and the bad guys, so to speak. And that's the way to do that early on. So it's sort of a race to the phone for you to make sure you initially identify that you're the victim and who the perpetrators are. Because the system sort of, I think, assumes that whoever calls first is the victim and has the opportunity to start the ball rolling in terms of the assumptions for the situation. Because I think the law enforcement system assumes there's going to be a victim and a perpetrator.
And the bad guy, you alluded to this, knows that that's the dynamic oftentimes, is that the person who complains first, the person who calls first, is often seen as the victim. And criminals are often involved in the criminal justice system and know how it works and have been through cases before. And oftentimes the responsible gun owner hasn't been through the criminal justice system and doesn't know that dynamic. So it's useful to know that ahead of time, that there is this race to the telephone when there's a defensive gun use, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and you mentioned dynamic. That's one of the things, and this is something, a phrase that I get from Masada Ayub. He talks about in a self-defense or in the aftermath of a self-defense encounter, it's important that we establish the active dynamic. And that's what you're doing essentially with the 911 call. Hey, I was the victim, and somebody else was the perpetrator. It also demonstrates, making that 911 call, that there's no consciousness of guilt. Get that out. People that flee or avoid the authorities there may be assumption there that there's some sort of guilt associated with it. And we'll talk about staying at the scene in a little bit. But anytime there's a defensive gun use, that DGU, we want to make sure we call 911. Now, what is a defensive gun use? The easy one is a discharge. We had to use a firearm because we were facing an immediate, otherwise unavoidable threat of death or grave bodily harm. So we discharged the firearm. That's clearly defensive gun use. If we point the firearm at somebody in Indiana, for instance, that's a serious defensive gun use. But for the self-defense, pointing a firearm at somebody in Indiana, it's a misdemeanor if it's unloaded, and if it's loaded, it's a felony. So it's very serious. Even if we use the firearm, it's what we call at low ready, meaning it's pointed in front of us at about a 45-degree angle, generally to the ground, not at someone. Even there, that's a defensive gun use. If that, we hope we never have to discharge the firearm, but maybe we have to present the gun at low ready, and that stops the threat. What if we put our hand on the gun? It's concealed, which we advocate concealed versus open carry. It's concealed. We reveal the gun, put our hand on the gun. Is that a defensive gun use? In my estimation, it is. And what if we just say, I have a gun, and nobody even sees the gun? Really? Is that a defensive gun use? Probably. And I would suggest you call 911 in those circumstances. We know someone, a friend of ours, that was a very similar thing happened. And why it's important, the gun wasn't revealed, and you may say, hey, Lee, get out of the area. I have a gun, whatever. We won't go into the circumstances, but let's say that's perfectly legitimate. That bad guy or gal may get on the phone and say, hey, Mike, he got a gun out, he pointed it at me, he did all these other things, and it's not true. But he says that the bad guy says that. So now I'm accused of pointing a loaded firearm at somebody. And remember what I said in Indiana, that's a felony. So we don't want that bad guy to get the jump on us, so to speak, in a lot of ways. But by us calling 911, we established that dynamic as to what happened. Hey, somebody threatened me with a knife. I told them I had a gun. I didn't get it out. And they left. I just want to report this. Okay. So that's a defensive gun use. We probably should call 911 on.
And you alluded to a friend of ours, Paul Lathrop is the incident his incident is the one you're referring to. He's talked about this on numerous podcasts, but I don't think anyway that the perpetrator even saw his gun, but Paul said, I have a gun. And this was as a guy was climbing up on his semi truck, and the incident diffused. Paul went on his way down the road, and the perpetrator called the police and reported that Paul had threatened him with a firearm. So even though the person didn't even see the firearm, and that was later revealed by his description of it, which was completely inaccurate, the perpetrator called 911, and Paul ended up having to defend himself in the court of law because the perpetrator had called 911 and falsely accused Paul of something he had not done.
Yep. So Paul perfectly innocently did what he did, but the bad guy took advantage of the system that we're talking about. And that's why we're having this little discussion this morning.
Yeah. So there's been a defensive gun use. Let's talk a little bit about the context in which this is going to be happening. So you're going to be making the 911 call, but you're not going to be in an air-conditioned room in your office or in your home. This is going to be in the aftermath of a situation where you feared for your life. So let's talk about that a little bit. You want to get into that some?
Well, as human beings, when we're faced with a life or death situation, there are many physiological effects that we can, I guess, suffer or experience at the time of this life or death experience. And that life or death experience may be a critical incident in the context of a defensive gun use, a self-defense incident. Also, these life or death situations that may exist in an auto wreck or a fire or lots of other things, these can come up where we're faced with life or death situation, life or death events, and these physiological effects impact us. So anyway, here's some of these things that you might experience. And I think it's important to understand that, your level of training and thinking about these life or death situations, we understand, help us avoid some of these physiological effects. But anyway, some of these physiological effects can include this chemical dump that occurs. We have these chemicals to include adrenaline when we're faced with a life or death situation that just flood our bloodstream. That kicks in a freeze, flight, or fight reaction that we have, just kind of our basic animal instinct. You see the deer that just freezes in front of your headlights. We're trying to avoid that freeze or that freeze reaction if we can. You're going to probably have impaired vision. That's going to include tunnel vision. You're going to lose your depth perception, maybe. That's one of the reasons we teach scanning after the use of a firearm, because we're going to have that tunnel vision and we need to move our head to avoid that. Your heart rate is going to increase enormously. For essentially no reason. Yet generally our heart goes up and beats more because we're exerting ourselves, a lot of exercise. In a situation like this, your body reaction, maybe your heart rate elevates enormously without any concomitant physical activity, and you're going to lose fine motor skills. You ever got excited and tried to put a key into a lock and it's hard to do it, hard to get it in there? You're going to lose those fine motor skills. There's going to be time distortion. Time may speed up for you. It seems like most people, time slows down in a critical incident, but it'll seem like time is just going at an inordinately slow pace. Some people also have these out of body experiences. It's like they're looking at the scene from an elevated position or somebody else. They're not even in the scene. They'll have that experience. Once again, depending on our level of training, our reactions may not be so much cognitive or thoughtful. Our reptilian brain may take over in the situation, and we don't want that to happen because we want to be able to think through this situation if we can, because we don't want to, I talk about people just kind of spacing out on the situation. That could happen to some people. And also, one of the things that's going to happen, this is important for the aftermath more later on, you're going to have memory distortion. We understand that it takes 2 or 3 sleep cycles for us to remember a situation. So you're going to be faced with that as well. And we'll talk about that more in other episodes, but that's one of the reasons we're going to tell you not to talk to government authorities, at least very much at all, until you've had, number one, an opportunity to consult with counsel and you got counsel there. But number two, you actually are going to remember the situation more accurately and more, what's the word I'm looking for other than accurately? I guess a synonym, but you're going to remember it truer to what really happened after you have 2 or 3 sleep cycles.
Yes. So the important part, and like you said, we can spend several episodes on these physiological and psychological effects that people experience in life or death encounters. But the important thing, and you mentioned this earlier in your comments, is that if you know about these sort of experiences ahead of time, and when you experience them, you're more likely to be able to work through them, so that you're not subject to that freeze response, or so that you don't sort of think that something is wrong with me because I'm experiencing this and sort of have an anxiety or panic attack. So the important thing is to know about these ahead of time and realize that it's possible, because not only is it important to know about them for the critical incident itself, but also for the aftermath, including the 911 call, and then how you interact with responding officers and investigating officers.
Yeah, and even after that, in the days and weeks after that, it's important to understand the sorts of things you might experience. Once again, we want you to be the person. I don't think I've mentioned this today, but in previous episodes, we don't want you to be the person that thinks this is surreal and you've never heard of the experiences that you're going through. We want you to be the person that says, I knew this could happen and I know what to do. Yeah. That's what we're trying to work for.
Yeah. And one of the things that you can do to sort of obviate or minimize these effects is, like we said, to think about it ahead of time, but also to practice and visualize how you might handle the situation. Because if you've visualized it ahead of time and you've gone through those repetitions in your head, that raises your level of competence with respect to that action. And that includes the critical incident itself, but also how you would handle the aftermath, including the 911 call. So, and we've talked about these in previous episodes, but there are generally 4 levels of competence when it comes to a skill. We've talked about the unconscious incompetence. That's somebody who doesn't even know that they don't have the skill or knowledge. Then there's the conscious incompetence. That's the person who knows they don't have the skill or the knowledge to handle the situation or to perform the action. And then there's conscious competence, which is the person who knows how to do it but has to think through it. And then there's unconscious competence, which is that skill or knowledge that's just second nature. You just know it or can perform that action without thinking about it. And that's where we want these sorts of skills to be, is at this unconscious competence level for that life or death encounter. So, and that's applicable, like you said, before, during, and after this critical incident. So let's talk a little bit about.
Can I just say something else about that?
Sure.
And we always, not always, but we talk about this almost in every podcast we have, or whatever these things are called, podcast or YouTube things. But it's so important that we get as many skills as we can to that unconscious competence stage. And that's from, just pressing the trigger to the 911 call and to other things even after that. Because we want to free that unconscious competence is things we just do automatically, and we don't tax our cognitive thought process. We want as much capacity as we can to think through the situation. We don't want to have to think through how to fix a malfunction or how to press the trigger or front sight press or the flash sight pick. We don't want to have to be thinking about those things, because a gunfight or a defensive gun use, Tiger McKee used to talk about this. It's problem solving is what it is. That's what a self-defense encounter is. It's trying to solve a problem. And we want to be able to have as much brain power as we can to try to solve that problem. And we'll have the more brain power to focus on that problem if we've got all these skills, these gun handling skills, these marksmanship skills kind of put away in our brain to a level that we can perform them at a unconscious competence level.
Yeah. So we're both attorneys, and I think we've been talking now for almost 20 minutes. I think it's time to get to the subject of the podcast itself. Yeah. I think only attorneys could talk for 20 minutes before getting to the subject, the meat of the subject anyway.
Well, but I mean, once again, I think in context is important to understand why this skill, why the 911 call is important to think about ahead of time.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the context in which you're going to be making the call is extremely important. I think something that people woefully underestimate.
Yeah, because it's going to seem easy.
Yeah,
you're listening to this on Sunday afternoon and relaxed, and it doesn't seem like a big deal.
Yeah, but
when all those other things happen, and you have those physiological changes, may not be the case.
Yeah. So the defensive gun use, the DGU, has taken place in whatever form. Either there's actually been a shooting where you've had to discharge your firearm in self-defense, or you've simply displayed or said, I've got a firearm, and the person goes away. Now you got to make the 911 call. What do we do?
All right. So this is critical that we think about this ahead of time. First of all, generally speaking, you're not going to leave the scene unless safety dictates. Leaving the scene is sort of associated with guilt. The guilty don't flee. Now, are there situations that may come up where you may have to leave the scene? I don't know. You come upon a gang's chasing you or whatever. I mean, you may have to leave the scene, but I would suggest to you that you still make the 911 call as quickly as possible. Okay. And you're going to have to eventually be able to articulate why you left the scene for safety reasons. Assuming you stay on the scene or wherever you're at, we want to maintain our situational awareness. Just because we remember that tunnel vision we talked about, that focus, you need to maintain that situational awareness because there may be other things you didn't realize were going on, other bad guys, other things. So maintain that situational awareness if you can. One thing, we'll talk about what to say on the 911 call in a minute or two. But one thing else that I think is important for you to think about is who should make the 911 call. I mean, obviously, if you're the sole good guy on the scene, you're there, you're alone, you're going to have to make the 911 call. But many times we're with friends or family. And I think it's important that you think about what's going to happen in a situation where probably you were involved, or maybe you were involved. Are you going to make the phone call? Are you going to have your spouse make the phone call, another family member? And here's what I want you to think about there. Is that family member, it's probably not a bad idea to have somebody else that wasn't involved make the 911 call, but here's the real risk with that. Is that person disciplined enough and trained to be able to make that 911 call and know what you know about what should be said and what shouldn't be said with respect to that 911 call? If your family member is that squared away, then I think you're good to go. And to let your spouse, for instance, I'm perfectly happy with my spouse making that 911 call. I'd be happy with you making that 911 call. Ryan, your brother, my other son, our other son making the call. But that may or may not be the case for you, and you're going to have to make that assessment.
Yeah, so you've got to decide who makes the 911 call, which is going to be situationally dependent. But once you get to the call, now what sorts of things do we want to convey? Because we don't want to tell them everything about what happened, right? I mean, we just want to convey the basic information that they need to know.
Yep.
And what else do we want to do?
We want to talk about that. what information we want to convey when we make that phone call.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, I'm not a fan of having in your wallet this little card that says my name is, I don't like that. I just don't like it. I'll leave it at that. I think these things, you need to think about them ahead of time, and you need to be able to perform them when it happens. If it happens, of course, we hope it doesn't. You're going to give them your name. You're going to give them your location, 123 West Street, whatever, Anytown, USA. And then I think it's a good idea to, once again, start establishing that active dynamic. I was attacked, I had to defend myself. Maybe I just had to defend myself, but that's going to be all. You're never, ever going to start talking about distances and times. That's it. Just, hey, I had to defend myself. Send the police and EMS, please. I also think it's a good idea to give a description, because one of the things we're concerned about, remember we talked about those physiological changes that occur to you. Well, guess what? The police are going to be notified after this 911 call about a, quote, shooting, end quote. I don't like using the word shooting because we go shoot when we do competition or target practice or whatever, but they're going to be notified that there's a shooting. They're going to roll up on this scene, and depending on their level of competence, they're going to be all hyped up as well. So we don't want them to make an error in judgment in terms of safety for anybody at the scene. So I say that and would tell you that it's a good idea to give them a description of yourself. Hey, I'm going to be the guy in the white t-shirt with blue jeans and black boots, and I'm going to have my hands when the police roll up on the hood of a white Ford pickup truck, so that there's no misunderstanding about who the good guys are here. And I'm starting to get into the aftermath, but that may be something that you want to relay on the 911 call as well, a description of yourself. Now, be careful. I've heard attorneys say that's not a good idea because the police may misunderstand who the good guy or the bad guy is then. They may think that you're describing the bad guy. I'm not sure that's going to happen. I think I'm still more confident in saying, hey, here's what I look like, a description of myself.
The main thing is you don't want the police to show up and think that you're the bad guy.
Yeah.
They know that a firearm was discharged. And if they show up and see that you have a firearm, you don't want that mistake to happen, so that you create a dangerous situation where you could end up being shot by the police if they believe that you're the bad guy. So you want to make sure that you identify yourself clearly, and that there's no mistake about who you are when they show up.
Yeah. So the essential stuff is your name, your location. I had to defend myself. Please send the police and EMS. I'm a 60-year-old, 5'9" guy that's going to have a white, whatever, little description, and I'm the good guy. Here's where I'll be. Beyond that, you're going to have to decide whether we'll talk about this more, whether you're going to hang up or stay on the phone. There is, I suppose, the potential that you might have to tell them, depending on the situation, some additional info, like, don't come through I always use this example, don't come through the basement because my dog is there and may attack you. Okay. But essentially, that's going to be it. And then you're going to have to decide whether to stay on the phone or hang up.
And there's a lot of debate around this particular issue about whether to remain on the phone. I personally like the idea of remaining on the phone because the situation at the scene may change before the police arrive, and you want to have that open line of communication with the dispatcher so that they can relay that information to the responding officers. But with that said, the dispatcher is trained to pump you for information. So do not give more information than this basic information that we're describing to you today, and enough information to maintain safety at the scene for when the officers arrive. Because remember, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, this 911 call is recorded. And if you're ever charged, it could be played either for you or against you, but it's likely going to get played at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I used to be just hang up because you don't need to say anything more. You need to maintain that situational awareness, what's going on. But on the other hand, and I think it depends on the situation, staying on the phone can serve a real safety purpose. For instance, if you're in your home, there may be still a bad guy somewhere in the home. The 911 operator may tell you, I've heard this on not personally, but recordings, where the 911 operator is trying to get you to get rid of your firearm. Well, it's not a good idea to get rid of your firearm if there's still bad guys in the home. But at the same time, the 911 operator doesn't want you to shoot the responding officer. So if you're on the phone, you can kind of coordinate that with the 911 operator. Hey, tell me when they're in my driveway and at the front door, and then I'm going to put my firearm away. So it can serve a purpose to stay on the line.
Yeah.
Just don't start willy-nilly talking about what happened, because remember, you may be suffering from memory distortion, and now is not a good time to make a mistake, a legitimate mistake that may be used against you weeks or months later.
So one question that we get quite a bit is, should I provide first aid either to the person that was attacking me and I had to shoot, or to other potential casualties on the scene? You want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and we're just mentioning this because after you've made the 911 call, you're waiting for the first responding officers to arrive. There may be an opportunity to do first aid. Here's the deal with that, in my estimation. It's going to be completely situationally dependent. And the top priority at that juncture is safety. If the bad guy needs first aid, I mean, I can see scenarios where you might want to provide that, depending, especially if somebody else is on the scene with you. But then again, my guess is most situations you're not going to have time to offer first aid between the 911 call and when officers arrive. So you're just going to have to make that call at the time.
But that's ensuring the safety and security of the scene is the main objective here, because a lot of times perpetrators are not alone, depending on the situation, and there can be multiple perpetrators. So you don't want to lose your awareness of the entirety of the scene while you're providing first aid. So first aid can be risky, and while you might be able to do it, the main priority is going to be to maintain safety of the scene.
Yeah, and I think we see officers many times now. I mean, they're involved in a shooting and they provide first aid, but there's usually, by that time, there's 2 or 3 or 4 or even more other officers at the scene to provide security. So, I mean, keep in mind, EMS. I'm not an EMS person or a paramedic, but they're not going to go on a scene and provide first aid even unless there's site security.
Yeah. So we've alluded to this a little bit about making sure that the officers know who you are when they show up on the scene. And that gets into the responding officers and sort of the later aftermath. And I think we can address that in future episodes. But for the purpose of the 911 call, the main point is to convey just enough information to establish the active dynamic, your location, the high level, what happened. I was attacked. I had to defend myself, that sort of information. But there are a few other things that people should consider, and we've alluded to this a little bit, is that this 911 call is recorded. So if you are charged with a crime, this may be the only thing that ever gets played at trial, potentially. Or it may be enough to demonstrate to the prosecutor through negotiations that, hey, this is a case that should be dropped, or that you actually did nothing wrong. So this is a very important first step in the aftermath of a self-defense encounter that people often underestimate. The other thing is that, like we said, the prosecutor may play this in a jury trial. It may get played in the press, and you are going to be experiencing those physiological effects that we were talking about. So I think it's hard to emphasize enough that this is something you should give a substantial amount of thought to, so that when that incident does happen, you knew it could happen. You knew you might experience these physiological effects, and you can perform what the actions you need to perform nevertheless. Mike, you want to say anything else about the 911 call, or some things you think people ought to know?
Well, just remember that obviously it'll be recorded. I think all your listeners will understand that, but it won't be recorded in all likelihood simply from the time that the operator says hello. As soon as you make that phone call, I'm assuming you make it on a mobile phone in all likelihood. As soon as the technical connection is made, there will probably be a recording started at that juncture, and there may be a little delay between that time and when the operator says, hello, what's the nature of your emergency? But just remember, I mean, and we want to make this just absolutely clear. Keep it simple. My name, my location. I had to defend myself, send police, EMS, and I'm the good guy, and here's what I'm wearing, or here's a description of myself. And that's probably all we're going to need to do. And then give some thought about hanging up or staying on the line, depending on the situation. But that's really it. I think we've covered most things. And then the next phase is when, we talked about first aid. The next phase is when the first responding police officers arrive at the situation, at the scene.
Okay. Well, I think that's where we'll leave it for now then. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thanks again, Mike, for joining the show. And thanks everybody for tuning in. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.